Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I'm doing the Nonfiction on BookTube tag. This tag, hope that's the name of it. I forgot to write the name down. I'll put the name in the title. This tag was created by Olive from a book Olive, who is our bodhisattva in terms of nonfiction. She's leading us all on the right path to read more nonfiction. Forgive me, the nonfiction book I've been reading deals a lot with Buddhism. Anyway, so the idea here is there are 10 prompts, 10 questions to answer that relate to, a booktuber like me's reading of nonfiction. And this is kind of a way for us to kind of build the nonfiction booktube reading community, which, as Olive points out, actually does exist. So prompt number 1 is essentially just what percentage of your reading is nonfiction. I'm kind of embarrassed to tell you that probably right now only about 20% of my reading is nonfiction. As someone who studied history and got advanced degree in history, I did a lot of nonfiction reading for quite a long time, and so it's not that I got burned out, but I've always loved fiction. And if you know anything about kind of even my nonfiction interests, they have a tendency to be kind of literary in their interests. So I've always loved reading fiction, and I've kind of just gotten away from reading nonfiction until relatively recently again. Let's see. Problem number 2 is what kind of nonfiction content do you create? Well, I do book reviews of nonfiction books that I read. I just recently did a book review of Lucy Worsley's biography of Queen Victoria. I didn't really do a review, but I did a discussion of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own on my Saturday Hodgepodge. In addition to that, I have a whole series of videos which are kind of nonfiction videos about famous American authors. I have a series about Hemingway and why Hemingway was the kind of toolbox that he was in real life, maybe, and maybe generate a little bit of understanding of why he was that way. And I have a series on Faulkner that kind of explains 3 themes that appear in Faulkner's novels. Race, class, and violence are 3 themes. So I've done that. Also, I have a series on World War I fiction, which I discuss various works of fiction about World War I written by American authors who actually experienced World War I on some level. Prompt 3 is your favorite subgenre of nonfiction. That's definitely biography. And if we get even more specific, the subgenre would be literary biography. I like reading about writers. I like writing about writers. That's just one of my interests. I don't know, it's some kind of weird amalgamation. My dad was a history person and my mom was an English teacher, and I guess that's what came out, somebody who's interested in the history of writers and literature. Prompt 4 is your favorite nonfiction book. I'm actually going to pick 2. The first is called Max Perkins, Editor of Genius, and I'll try to put the pictures somewhere on here. It's by A. Scott Berg, and it basically talks about famous Scribner's editor Max Perkins and his professional and sometimes personal relationship with authors like Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Woolf. It's just exactly up my alley of things I like. It's literary history, it's biography, it talks about writers that I've had a real interest in. And the other one is called The Great War in Modern Memory. It's by Paul Fussell. I think Paul Fussell ended up becoming somewhat controversial. He wasn't necessarily a nice person, but this book really kind of hit exactly again what I like. It was really about how literature has influenced our view of World War I almost from the very beginning, from the World War I poets to Eric Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front and others, and how that then translated into movies and our popular ideas about World War I. And I'm one of those people who thinks that we oftentimes forget how important World War I was in shaping the world we still live in, how much it destroyed people's confidence in progress, and kind of, I think, led us on this kind of cynical path that we seem to be on today. We're getting close to the anniversary of the end of World War I, which here in the United States we call Veterans Day, but it was originally called Armistice Day. I've noticed that in watching my Premier League soccer that people in England are wearing the poppies in memory of that, which, you know, just kind of, I think, explains how important the war was and still is, and that book kind of explores how much of our ideas of the war were influenced by writers and literature. Prompt number 5 is, what do you think keeps people from reading more nonfiction? And I'm going to say something, I don't want this to come out the wrong way, but it probably is. And maybe this is just like an old man perspective. But I think increasingly what we see are people who read to escape. You know, the world is hard. I'm not necessarily saying it's harder than it was in other times, but the world is hard, and I think particularly with young people, they are facing some kind of issues in their lives, issues in the country that on some level are really, really disturbing and unsettling, and they feel, you know, a certain amount of unease. And I think reading fiction, particularly genre fiction, just kind of takes them away from that. It's not just young people, it would be all people. I think this explains the continuing popularity of YA as a genre with people who move beyond the, you know, typical YA demographic. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, by the way. Reading as a form of escape has a long history in all societies, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that or with reading YA. But I think that explains the appeal of YA, that there's something kind of comforting about that formula, about those stories which are set in young people's recent past. I think that explains, you know, why science fiction and fantasy novels are so popular, because they can show us conflict in a world that isn't ours, and a world in which we don't necessarily have to be the ones dealing with all the consequences. And so, because people read fiction, I think, increasingly as a form of escape, they don't want to be confronted with the reality of nonfiction. I think what most people think of in terms of nonfiction is very serious work about, you know, the environment, or about political issues, or works of history that will just remind them, perhaps, that, you know, things are not as they should be. Anyway, that's my old man 2 cents on the subject. Okay, prompt number 6 is, why do you like nonfiction? Well, you know, as a person whose primary academic interest was always in history is nonfiction, and you know, from my earliest memory, I've always been interested in history. I think I was given history books, a history book of the Civil War and a history book of the American Revolution for my birthday when I was in the 3rd grade. A book, one of the most important books in my life, is a book I got from my grandmother, which is essentially kind of a history travel book of England and Ireland. And I've always been interested in history, and therefore always been a reader of nonfiction in some ways. And the other thing I would just say is that you know, I have a tendency to kind of find a new subject, something new that I find really interesting, and I just love kind of chasing that idea or that subject down the proverbial rabbit hole and going as far with it as I want to go. And, you know, nonfiction allows you to do exactly that. You can go as deep, or you can stay as shallow in trying to understand or trying to explore your interest as you want to. There's almost no limit to how far you can go. As I tease my kids all the time, if you're really interested in tractors, you can find history books about, you know, individual tractor companies and the tractors those companies made and their impact on, you know, specific region. I mean, it's incredible how much stuff there is like that. And everything, every subject, every topic has a history, and every topic has people writing books about it, from Pokemon to knitting to basketball to, you know, you can find that stuff, and if that's what your interest is, you can find stuff, nonfiction, to read that you won't find boring at all. Next prompt, let's see. The next prompt is to name some nonfiction books you found through BookTube. Well, there have been a lot of these lately. I mentioned I read the Lucy Worsley biography of Queen Victoria for Victober. I also was reading a biography of Queen Elizabeth to go along with ShakeTube. Thanks to Jason and his You Carry Your Coffin series about mortality and death in movies and fiction, I read Drew Gilpin's Faust, This Republic of Suffering. Thanks to BookTube, I was aware of the name Valeria Luiselli. So when I saw that my son, for one of his classes, had Valeria Luiselli's essay book about trying to help migrants and refugees enter the United States called Tell Me How This Ends, I read that. Last year I posted a video about history and trying to encourage people to read more history books as a part of nonfiction, and somebody called me out that I don't think I had any books written by women or about women, and then called into question one of my choices about indigenous peoples and suggested a book, and I read The Indigenous Peoples History of the United States as a result of that. I would hazard a guess that I get as many suggestions about nonfiction reads as fiction books from BookTube. Prompt number 8 is the best nonfiction book you've read lately, and I'm going to go with Drew Gilpin Faust, This Republic of Suffering, which is about how the Civil War affected our ideas about death and burial and memory, and how it just was this real period of deep national suffering. Prompt number 9 is nonfiction goals. You know, what kind of goals you have for nonfiction? Well, obviously, I think the obvious answer is I would like to increase the amount of nonfiction that I read. I think this will be helped by the fact that I am going to be a BookTube prize judge this year, and that should help me. I volunteered to read in a nonfiction category. I think that should definitely help me in terms of my reading of nonfiction. I imagine I'm going to get plenty of nonfiction as a result of that decision. Number 10 was for incorporating more nonfiction into your reading. And what I would say is just kind of related to something I've already said, is that there's something you are interested in. I refuse to believe there are human beings in the world who have no interest in anything outside their own lives. It may seem that way. I may feel like I know a few people about whom that statement is true, but that cannot be true of most people. It just can't. And so what I would say is, if you're interested in anything, there are nonfiction books for you. Okay, so this is the me you get to look at after work when I think I'm being really clever and filming a video in my truck on my way to work, and then I forget one of the prompts. So the last prompt on the Nonfiction on BookTube tag is to name other nonfiction booktubers, other booktubers who talk about or do nonfiction stuff. And so I made a list. I have a feeling my list probably contains names that most people have already listed, but just a few. David Murphy, that's the name of his channel. David Murphy does a lot of nonfiction. A lot of what he does is economics. He's like a finance major or an economics major. And I have to be honest with you, that is probably the last thing I'd want to study, but he also does a lot of history, really kind of in-depth, big history book reading. So definitely David Murphy. There's also Peg at the History Shelf, who, wait, surprise, surprise, Peg at the History Shelf talks about history books on her channel. Jason Old Blues Chapter and Verse, he does some nonfiction, as you heard in some may answer my questions. He's the reason why I read This Republic of Suffering by Drew Gilpin Faust, which is my favorite nonfiction read of the year. Justin, aka Ghost Reader, over at Ghost Reader, he does a lot of nonfiction. Had a really great series on World War I last year, which was just amazing. You should definitely check him out. Andrea at Infinite Text, she reads some nonfiction. A lot of the nonfiction she reads has to do with death. She has a whole shelf of books which she calls the Death Shelf, where she reads about issues related to death and funeral rites. And if you're interested in that, I'm telling you, her channel would definitely be a place to go. Lukas over at Totally Pretentious. Sometimes what he reads, I guess, is technically not nonfiction, but it's like really, really classic works of philosophy and sometimes literature, but also history as well. He read, I believe he read the Peloponnesian Wars by Thucydides last year, so he does a lot of nonfiction. Tilly over at Tilly's Shelf recently did a nonfiction kind of discussion about tuberculosis. Tilly works in the medical field, and so she sometimes talks about nonfiction subjects related to medicine and related to the refugee issue problems that exist in Europe, and even though she doesn't reference directly the ones here in the United States, but kind of a similar problem. Mark over at Richardson Reads, he reads a lot of nautical stuff and other works of non-fiction. He's a librarian, he has access to lots of stuff. I don't think I've seen anybody mention Joe over from Joseph Francis Burton's channel. He reads a lot of non-fiction, and he particularly likes reading religious studies and things having to do with religion and the Bible, and just some really great discussions and in-depth videos of religious texts and nonfiction discussions of religious texts. Brianna at Brianna's library, she pretty much does only nonfiction, and if David Murphy is kind of our conservative, pro-capitalist economist on BookTube, then Brianna is kind of our left-wing political, social idea reader. She's a great channel. She reads a lot of great books in a tremendous amount of depth. And then I think the last one I have, other than obviously Olive, who started Nonfiction November, and Steve Donahue, who reads everything and a lot of nonfiction. The last one I want to mention is the Medieval Reader. She reads, as the name suggests, a lot of medieval texts in fiction and nonfiction. Anyway, I will try to remember to take this list in the house and put all those channels in the show notes down below so you can find them. I look forward to your comments in the comments section. I hope my camera is not too crooked here in the truck, and as always, thank you for watching.